Welcome back. Carry on flying is what the government has told the British public in its plan to reduce transport emissions to virtually zero by 2050. Ministers say that new technology will allow domestic flights to be emissions-free by 2040 and international aviation to be zero carbon by the mid-century. The policy has been ridiculed by environmentalists who say the government is putting far too much faith in the power of innovation. Well, joining us now is Transport Secretary Grant Shapps. Let's start off with this expectation of innovation. What are the latest developments on low emission flying?
Sure. Well, the first thing I actually should say is the transport decarbonisation plan we're launching today may sound a bit dull, but it's actually very profound. It deals with the biggest single source of carbon in our economy, which is through transport. It should say that flying is 1.2% of the transport bit of carbon. So it's not by far and away the largest part. But to directly answer your question, we've got sustainable aviation fuels coming along. We've had the world's first hydrogen aircraft fly in the United Kingdom, and we've got battery technology coming on. So there are a variety of different technologies which are helping to already point the way to the future of aviation.
Encouraging, I suppose, for people that have been more sceptical about the government's plans to reach net zero by 2050 overall, because of course what a lot of people have been saying is that this is going to be inordinately expensive if we base it on the technology that we have today, and we may well have much more advanced technology in the coming decades. The criticism, of course, is that this is a bit of guesswork, it's a bit of a gamble. I'm assuming you're thinking this is a gamble worth taking.
Well, the whole plan today, the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, is very detailed, and there are 10 different associated consultations and analytical reports come along with it. But actually, we're quite confident about this because actually, when I mention that transport's the biggest emitter of carbon, I should also say that 90% of it comes from our roads. Unfortunately, when it comes to road transport, the solution's already here. We're seeing 1 in 7 cars already being sold with a plug on the end of it. In other words, electric. And we've got other technologies coming along, like hydrogen, being used potentially for some of the heavier goods vehicles. And one of the things we've said today is that heavy goods vehicles will also have to go zero carbon by 2040, but the smaller, 26 tons and less by 2035. So we're setting out our stall, we're setting out the technology. Fortunately, as I say, you can clear up 90% of it by clearing up our roads, and the technology is already there. I've been driving an electric car for the last couple of years. They work fabulously well. We want to see more of them on our roads and more infrastructure to support them.
They are marvellous, some of these electric cars. However, they're a lot easier for people that live in central London, where there are charging points just about everywhere, than people who live a bit further afield, especially to get those fast charging points. There just don't seem to be very many of them around the country. What's the government doing to try and install those?
Well, surprisingly, there are actually more charging locations in the UK now than there are petrol stations. So we've seen a big proliferation of this in the last couple of years. Secondly, 2/3 of people actually do have driveways and garages. What we're interested in is how we plug that gap, as you say, for the third of people who don't. And we're investing massively in the rollout of charging on streets, and even very interesting innovative technologies. For example, we have an experiment that we've announced, which is wireless charging. So under the street, you just park and charge a vehicle. So there are lots of things which will come along to help plug the gap in the next few years. We don't have to do it all instantly, but as I say, really positive signs with more and more people switching to electric vehicles and new technologies like hydrogen coming down the track.
I suppose you need councils to work with you with this. I should probably declare a personal interest here. My dad's got an electric car and no driveway, and charging it is an absolute nightmare. Is the government going to really pile any pressure on local councils to try and...
well, name and shame the council. That's what I say, because we're giving them a lot of cash and make... Sorry, where is it?
Cambridge City Council.
Cambridge, well, they are being offered a lot of money by government, and I have to check what Cambridge are doing, but a lot of local authorities have been taking that up and installing street charging in order to sort of kickstart the whole kind of infrastructure required around this. As I say, actually, last week in Parliament, I announced we've hit, this month, 25,000 publicly available chargers. 4,000 of them are rapid chargers, so they charge in very little time indeed. And I'm interested. Your dad will be our test case. Cambridge, come on, Cambridgeshire Council, let's get this sorted out.
And whilst you're here, I do have to ask you about another aspect of transport, which is wearing masks on public transport. We know this morning that the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has said he's going to make masks mandatory on the tube across the Transport for London network. Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, says he's not going to make them mandatory, but that they will be strongly encouraged. Which mayor is taking the right approach?
Yeah, well, I said when we announced that it will no longer be the law that you have to wear a face covering in every location, that we will invite the transport operators to set out their what's called conditions of carriage. So you can't get on, you won't be able to get on a London Underground train without putting your mask on, because that's the condition by which they've sold you the ticket. And we've seen airlines do the same thing as well. So all the airlines, in fact, have come forward and said they'll expect people to wear face coverings and require them to in order to take the flight. And this is exactly what we expect to happen and should happen. The reason is that clearly it's crazy to have a law in place that if you're on your own in a carriage, perhaps travelling on a long distance route, that you should have to, by law, wear a face covering, whereas on London Underground it makes perfect sense. So it's horses for courses. We're asking transport operators to come forward and do this. People are still going to need to pop out with their face covering in any case, and they'll just pop them on when they're in a location which is crowded, like the London Underground in the future.
I noticed you mentioned the London Underground, you mentioned some airlines. You didn't mention any train companies. No train companies so far have said that they will mandate masks. It seemed like you were expecting some companies to take on this responsibility. Are you disappointed in the train companies?
No, well, just to be clear, ultimately, because of the way that the pandemic has evolved, and of course our shift to Great British Railways, which is the reform of our railways, the government's effectively in charge of our railway companies. And what we'll do is to obviously monitor the amount of traffic and congestion. We're advising people always to wear a mask if you're in a very confined space and the ventilation isn't good and you're very close to people. Of course, people understand that after tackling coronavirus for such a long time. But no, I'm not disappointed. Otherwise, I'd be disappointed with myself, to answer your question.
Right, well, thank you very much for coming on the show this morning, Grant Shapps, Transport Secretary. Of course. Cheers.
Yes, well, coming up, we'll find out what your thoughts are on wearing a mask past July the 19th, that Freedom Day, in GB Views. First, time for the weather.